other people can view it and get on there. So welcome, Nancy. Glad to have you in class. And so this is what we're going to be doing. We're going to be going over, there was a few questions that I just kind of highlighted out of the email questions. And if you would like to ask another question, feel free to, but here's the questions and I'm going to kind of address them and then we'll move into the subject matter of chapters 5 through 6. And no, I don't want to stop. Oh, interesting. Sorry about that. Okay, so the question is, I'm a store manager at a tiny market store in town. One of my pet peeves is when parents allow their very young children to run around the store. My job is definitely not to babysit a customer's 2-year-old child. However, regards to safety aside, I had always been under the impression parent-child interaction in a store setting can be beneficial to a child's early development, and etc. So I'm going to say something that everybody has a different perspective about this question. You know, should children be run around the store or should they be more monitored? But I'm going to say that children need boundaries. And in our society, children need to know what's okay and what's not okay. And it certainly is important for children to be with their parents in, thank you for agreeing. It really is important for their parents to be with them and to supervise them and also to have a dialogue while they're shopping in the store, to talk to them about the things that they're buying in the store, help them pick out. I don't know if you go shopping, but I think you have a child. Tell me yes if you do. I'm not recalling. But I know that when I took my children shopping at the store that I always helped them with picking out things and having them pick out things. And it was a great learning opportunity. So anyway, that's my 2 cents. I'm sure that other people have different viewpoints, but that's my 2 cents. In terms of the next question about children's eyesight, we're going to actually talk about that under visual perception, so I'm going to not answer that question here. But somebody asked, yeah, I agree with you, Nancy. Including him on the decisions is good. Good. Do babies dream? That's a tough one. I know the book talked a little bit about it. I do think that they might dream. I don't know that we can identify that how they're dreaming because they can't articulate it, but certainly they do make faces when they're sleeping, as this question asked, and they make sounds, and so I think they do dream. I don't think that they're cognizant of their dream, and as we see in terms of cognitive development, as their brain's developing, that they're not able to dream. They probably dream more in images and things like that. And I think children have night terrors, so I do think that they are afraid and all of those things occur. So I do think that babies do dream. Okay, the next question, can a child inherit traits from a parent he or she has never met? I'm assuming that they mean biological traits, and certainly they do. And I will share a story with you that I have a friend whose brother was raised by only his mother. His father was never in the picture. His biological father never was a part of his life. And he is so much like his father that it's scary. Even some of his personality traits and some of the ways that he interacts. So I think that children do inherit traits from a parent that he or she has never met. I guess that depends on, too, if you believe that in nurture or nature, and or which is more stronger. And I think that there's a play on that, but I certainly think that our nature, which is our genetic composition, does play a trait, does play a role in how we develop. What do you think, Nancy? Do you think it plays a part in how we develop? This is kind of interesting. It would be fun if you could talk, but it's nice to have you on here, so I'm not doing it all by myself. All right, I agree too. I agree that environment is really important, and I think sometimes, and I don't know if you agree with this, but sometimes environment can have a play on what our genetic inheritance is, meaning that we may have a propensity for something negative, but environment can help to shape that and turn that into a more positive trait. And I also think the inverse can happen too. Even if our environment is positive, somebody who may have been born with a specific genetic trait, that environment may not be able to compensate for that. Okay. So why would a child who is fully potty trained prefer to have an accident than to use the restroom? And this person said there's no outside visual signs of this child being anxious or scared. I agree, but that can't be passed down, just the genetic part, right? I'm not sure what you mean by that. I agree, but that can't be passed down, just the genetic part. Can you elaborate? I don't know if I think there's an interplay between the environment and our genetic traits. I don't know that the environment changes our genetic traits. It may, I don't know how to say this, I don't want to say compensate, but it might alter what our genetic traits are, if that makes sense, Nancy. What do you think? Okay. Any additional comments about that? Okay. All right. The last question about the potty training. You're welcome. The last question about the potty training, I have to say, is that I don't think children prefer to have an accident. And I don't know exactly how old this child is, because in the question they don't say, but I'm assuming that they're probably early childhood. They may even be as much as 5, 6, 7, or 8. Even though they are fully potty trained, children have accidents. And depending, again, because I don't know the nature of this question, is this child having accidents once in a while? Are they having accidents all the time? If they're having accidents all the time, it could be a power play. It could be that maybe they're feeling pressured or yelled at to go to the bathroom or whatever, harshly treated, and so it's kind of a way to be, for lack of a better term, rebellious. But, and also sometimes kids get really into what they're doing and they forget that they have to go to the bathroom. And we, while as adults, we have a more fully formed ability to hold our, going to the bathroom. Children may not have that developed in early childhood. And when I say early childhood, I mean that through age 8, that they still have difficulties. And even, to be honest with you, some children have accidents even beyond that. Have you had an experience with, I know you said your son's 14. Yep, that's another thing that happens. Nancy made mention about heavy sleeping. Sometimes they have accidents at night because they're so fully asleep that they can't really pay attention to the signs. So anyway, thank you. We're going to go on. We're going to move on, and we're going to start talking about some of the things in Chapter 5. And this PowerPoint, I am going to make it available to everybody also on Blackboard. But this is really going to help you to study for the exam. So, okay. So the first thing I think, and I might not get through this whole PowerPoint, Nancy, by the way. I'm going to try as much as I can, but if I don't, I did make some notes on the PowerPoint so that you'd be able to refer back to it in case I'm unable to talk to it. So, here's the thing. In Chapter 5, it's really talking about physical growth. You're welcome. And this growth occurs head to toe. So our growth starts from our head and it goes down to our toe, and then it begins in the center of our body and it moves towards the extremities. And that's an important thing for us to note, because as children grow from head to toe, proximal distal, center of the body, and they move toward the extremity, our development is occurring in that way too. I think it's interesting that the book makes note that the brain is about 25% of the adult weight. And by the second birthday, the brain is 75% of adult weight. And so my question really is, does this validate the importance of early stimulation? What do you think, Nancy? Is it important? How so? What's important about early stimulation? And how should we be stimulating children at this age? What do you mean by control their behaviors? You said, I remember full brain development doesn't occur until 3. Oh, yeah. You're right. The way that we interact with them does help to mold them. And when I'm talking about early experiences, I mean, for example, talking to children as we're feeding them, whether we're nursing them or holding a bottle. That's an early experience. That's interaction. That's promoting brain development, because not only are they feeling the closeness of when we're holding them and feeding them, but we're also interacting with them, and their brain is moving. I know when I fed my children, as I was feeding them or even changing their diapers and all of those things, all of those early interactions help to promote their curiosity, their knowledge of the environment, so on and so forth. So you're right. I think it's really important, and it does mold them. It molds that brain into making the connections that are necessary for curiosity, for interest in things, for learning. And we need to start at the very beginning. Look at that. 50% happens within the first year. So really, 75% to 100% to the 100% it becomes of adult weight. It happens through, through the course of after their second birthday through adulthood. And I'm glad you are right. Talking to babies even during pregnancies, during your pregnancy, they can react to it. It talked about the last couple months of pregnancy where children are able to hear what you're saying, and it does stimulate their brain growth and build a strong bond. For example, when you do that, they recognize your voice, right? And then when they come out of the womb, they're able to attach to. And I saw that. My children are adopted, so I didn't have that experience personally, but certainly many of my friends who gave birth, they had those experiences, and I'm sensing that you had that same experience since you answered yes. Okay. So the book talked about the 4 lobes of the brain. And it talked about the frontal lobe, the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe, and the parietal lobe. And the frontal lobe, I don't really necessarily have to go into all of these definitions because it's on the PowerPoint here. But obviously we need all lobes of our brain to function. And in all of those lobes, there are neurons, and those neurons send the electrical and chemical signals, and those electrical and chemical signals during the process of myelinization become encased with this myelin sheath, and it's this layer of fat cells. And this layer of fat cells, and I wish I had a diagram, but I think if you could think of an electrical current and that conduit that goes around it, it's kind of the same thing. It insulates the axon, and it helps those electrical signals travel faster down that axon. And as that brain myelinizes, right, the process of myelinization, it starts at the back of our brain, and it works its way to the front of our brain. So as that happens, our brain becomes more in tune, and the impulses that we have become more streamlined, okay? But that is a whole lifetime it's not a whole lifetime process, but the brain myelinization process takes about 25 to 26 years. And when we talk about adolescence, I'll bring this point up again, but There's also some chemical things that occur in the brain that suspend sometimes reasoning and all kinds of things. So our brains are pretty complex. And it's an important thing for us to know that by us stimulating the brain, these electrical and chemical signals become stronger. And so do you have any questions about that before I move on? It fascinates me too. Brain development is so amazing. I think that once we understand it, it helps in practice how we interact with children, the importance of talking with them and showing them things and reading to them and all of those things that stimulate brain and allowing them to explore. And it helps to, yeah, it's not even fully understood. It's crazy, isn't it? It's just crazy what our brains are capable of. And unfortunately, well, I don't know how to say this, but unfortunately, some people think that because of the way that the brain, that all that stimulation, that they misinterpret the need for how we stimulate children. Children need to be fully active and participatory in their environment for that brain stimulation to occur. If we're just feeding them information, expecting them to memorize things, that's not really what grows our knowledge. In fact, that could even stifle it. So I'm going to move on because I want to get through some of this and I don't want to, it's already 7:18. So our brains and early experiences, the infant brain depends on experience to determine how connections are made. So our biological processes, which are genes, and our environmental experiences, which can be enriched or impoverished, have an effect on how our brain makes connections. The brain is plastic, and it's influenced by those things that are around us. So even cultural context, it shapes our brain in different ways. But and here's the thing, the development of the brain is closely linked with the child's cognitive development. So, and that's the neuroconstructivist view, which really talks about how children need to be really involved in their experiences so that it helps to determine and helps to make those connections. For example, can you come up with an example of that? Because I know you raised a 14-year-old, so I'm sure you have experiences. Well, actually, it doesn't have to be the neuroconstructivist view, but just really your experience of how maybe an example of your son and some things that you noticed, experiences that he had early on that you provided for him. Interaction is what I mean. But that would also be how you raised him, but the interactions. So the environmental, maybe the environmental experiences that you. So you would see him be curious about what you were showing him, the outfits. Hmm. I'm curious, does he like shopping now? Clothes shopping? I think that's probably his adolescent brain. Okay. Um, I just wanted to bring out this point about nutrition because I don't know if you had a chance to look at that video that I posted called Sugar is Killing Us. I thought it was an interesting video. I urge you to. It's only 3.5 minutes, but it really is important. But it talks about in the book how nutrition is so critical in the development of children and that they need to consume about 50 calories per pound of body weight. So if they weigh 6 pounds, right, they would need to consume about 300 calories, which is a lot different than adults. But here's the thing. What are we feeding our infants? Breast milk, bottle feeding. And while some people talk about the importance of breast milk in terms of bonding, really it's more the nutritional value. If the mother's eating healthy and the baby is drinking the breast milk, that is much healthier than what is found in formulas and things that are assisting, even baby foods. Because if you look at that video, it even talks about how high fructose syrup is found in so many things that it doesn't need to be in. And that's really affecting our growth and development. So I thought it was interesting. I'm going to move on, but I really would like to listen to your ideas about nutrition, because I did make a discussion board about that. So, and I know that you always have interesting things to share, Nancy, and others do too. I know others of you are going to be watching this and listening. So anyway, okay. So here's this idea of motor skill development and how it happens. So according to Giselle, who looked at many infants from actually just Caucasian infants, by the way, so it's kind of an interesting interesting in that way that they didn't look at other races or other ethnic groups. But when he looked at all of these different children, he looked at how their development seemed to be in a fixed order, meaning that a child would go from rolling to crawling to sitting to crawling to standing. And while it would happen at individual times, there was like an individual, for example, a child might sit up from like 4 to 6 months, right? So it was general, it was an average, but it just seemed to go in order. But what happened is, in later studies, they showed that motor development is not as fixed as Giselle indicated. And the dynamic systems view takes a look at what motivates children to move, to act, to use their perception. It has to be something that they perceive in their environment that motivates that. And to use their perceptions, because they do, and later on in the discussion we'll see that, to fine-tune their environments for them. And so what motivates them to do something, to create a new motor behavior? Many factors are a part of this new motor skill development, and the development of the nervous system, the body's physical properties, and its possibilities for movement, the goal the child is motivated to reach, and the environmental support for the skill. And what I mean by that is, I'm sure because you raised a child, I know that when my kids were little, I might take a toy and put it slightly out of their reach, which would motivate them to move, right? However, if they didn't have the physical ability to move, they wouldn't have been able to do it. So there has to be many things in place for that movement to occur. There has to be motivation, there has to be the body's physical ability to do that. And the child, is the child interested in that? If it's something that the child's not interested in, they may not pursue that. How would you tease your child? Right. Yeah, but it's true with toys and even with your voice, because they might even want to get closer to you, right? So by talking to them, it excites them and it makes them want to move. So you can attest to the fact that it isn't just one thing. There's many things in place that create children to use to develop motor skills. Okay. And it also depends on their mood. That's a good one. All right. There's a lot to cover. So here's the thing. Reflexes are going to be on the exam, but just kind of briefly. So just make sure you go over it. But I wanted to focus a little bit on gross motor skills and fine motor skills because those are important. Gross motor skills appear first because our gross motor skills, as we have that proximal distal nature of development. So our center of our body is where our more gross motor skills are, right? Our more larger muscles. And so so those develop first. And our fine motor skills are those finely tuned movements like grasping the toy, using a spoon, buttoning a shirt. That happens later on. So my question is, if you were working in an infant caregiver environment, what might you be able to do to promote gross and fine motor skills? Right. You're right. Like some of the toys that they might hold in their hands, right? You would want to have those things around, but those things would be, for an infant center, they'd want to be bigger, right? And as they get older, oh, did you get your camera on? Oh, it came on for a second, it looked like. What was I going to say? Oh, it looked like it just, the icon popped up for a second. So what was I going to say? Right. Oh, and so you would also want to have opportunities for them to have large spaces to move around. And as they're toddling, you'd want to have opportunities for them to be able to move. And as they start to find that, I posted in Chapter 5 resources some videos about gross and fine motor skills that might give you some other examples. But it is important to have those in to promote and help them define and redefine their gross motor skills and fine motor skills throughout, actually, to be honest, throughout their whole early childhood. Such an important part of them. Okay. All right. So moving on, and I am just kind of following the chapter, and I'm pulling out the things that I think are the most important. I obviously couldn't talk about everything. So we have sensory and we have perception, right? And our sensory receptors are our eyes, our ears, our tongues, our nostrils, our skin, our 5 senses. Those are our sensory receptors. And our perception is the interpretation of what is sensed. So I'll give you an example. Our tongue is a sensory organ. And why is it that somebody might like broccoli and another person may not like broccoli? Well, that's the interpretation, right, of what is sensed. It may taste good on your tongue and may not taste so good on somebody else's tongue. And I want to share a really interesting experience that I had. I went and did some internship at a Reggio-inspired preschool. And they had a chef that came in that was doing a study on taste in children. And what he found is there are people and children that can actually taste the dirt that a vegetable is grown in. And so they can, and they can taste that. And it's fascinating to me because I apparently don't have that type of sensory ability. But I just thought it was really fascinating that people can taste different things. It is interesting, isn't it, that they could actually taste the dirt. And they did this series of interviewing these children and their different experiences. They grew vegetables in different dirt and stuff like that. It's kind of fascinating. So that's that kind of example. So what we sense and what we interpret are different, which is why one of my things is I think it's important to ask children to taste things, but I don't think we should make them eat something because they may not like it. Did your son have anything that he doesn't like that you like, or vice versa? He hates vegetables. Did he always hate vegetables? Huh. Interesting. I love vegetables. How about you? And you know what? Our taste buds do change as we get older. Our likes and our dislikes. I know when I was a kid, I loved sugar cereal, and I can't stand it. It makes me nauseous to eat a cereal that's full of sugar. It makes me want to throw up. So our taste buds do change over time. Now, you know what? My son was like that too. He didn't like sugar either when he was a baby. Now he's an addict. He's a sugar addict. So, which is unfortunate. I need to show him that video. Mine's 22, almost 23. So, adults get to do what they want to do, right? Unfortunately. Okay. So, visual perception. The eyes are still developing at birth. So this is that question, you know, what do babies see? So what a newborn can see at 20 feet. Wait a minute. I think I reversed this. What a newborn can see at 20 feet. A typical adult can see at 240 to 260 feet. Yes, that's right. And by 6 months of age, that changes to about 20/40. So their eyes definitely do progress. Their color vision improves. From 4 to 8 weeks, they're able to see more in color. Their perceptual constancy, meaning that the infant is able to perceive an object regarding the distance as the same object. So you know how something might be further away and it looks different? So like if something's up close, it has a different appearance than if it's further away. But as adults, we can see that whatever that is, if it's a bike and it's close up, or if it's a bike and it's further away, we can tell that it's a bike. So can the child. And the same thing with sizes. Things look different, but there's still a constancy, so they're able to perceive that. And I think the most interesting thing is this depth perception. And what they did is to see if children had depth perception, and I'm sure it's in the book, they did this experiment of this visual cliff where they had a baby on a a checkerboard type of finish, and then there was a clear glass over what another checkerboard thing that the perception was that it was down, that there was a cliff there, but there wasn't a cliff because there was a plastic glass there, so that if the child were to crawl onto the glass, they wouldn't fall. But the child wouldn't do that. The child would stop at that edge of the cliff. So that means that they can perceive depth and that they know that there's a danger in depth, which is an interesting as well. Again, our brain is fascinating, the things that we're capable of. You know, we used to think that babies didn't know anything or do anything and that we could just leave them to their own devices. And we realized with the way that we're able to study brain development and all the other things that we've done, that it's important that we really do provide stimulating environments for the infants that we care for. Okay, and then there's the other senses, which are hearing, touch and pain, smell, taste. Infants can recognize pattern and tone, and this goes back to yep, they can recognize themselves pretty early too. They don't always know it's them though, right? sometimes they just they'll think it's another baby, but they're able to recognize. And they're able to recognize their body parts as well. Yeah. So infants can recognize pattern and tone during the last 2 months of pregnancy, right? What you were talking about. The baby, talk to the baby in utero, and when they come out, they recognize the tone and the pattern of your voice, which is pretty phenomenal. There's a really great video that I show in my face-to-face class called In the Womb, and it's a National Geographic video. So it might even be on Netflix. I don't know if you have Netflix. It's really interesting in looking at the different sensory experiences that happen during prenatal development. Touch and pain. They obviously feel touch and they need touch, and they feel pain. They used to believe that they didn't. The book uses that. Oh, wow, he does? Does he still really like the same music? That's cool. That's awesome. The book, getting back to the touch and pain, the book uses that example of circumcision where they don't give the child any anesthetic when they circumcise them and they scream. And I always share in my classes that my son was adopted and he came home when he was 6 months old and he wasn't circumcised, and because culturally that's what I thought we had to do, at 6 months I took him to the doctor, and I really had a very little window of time to have him circumcised, or he would have had to go into the hospital and be put under general anesthesia, which scared me a bit. So they gave him a local anesthesia, but he woke up and he was just in so much pain. And I have to tell you, if I were to do it over again, I would have never done that because I was just not as educated about it. I just really thought that it was an important thing. So anyway, smell, they can differentiate. You couldn't. You know what, today, Nancy, a lot of people aren't doing that. You know, in fact, in Europe, they don't circumcise. So, and there's a movement in America to stop doing it too, that it's cruel. And I kind of agree with it, I have to tell you. But people get to make their own choices. Yep, I've heard that too. You're right, it's not as common anymore, and people do think sometimes it's actually worse, that we're taking away the body's natural, whatever the reason that it's there, the natural reason that it's placed there. So, yeah. So children can smell, they can differentiate odors and taste. And is there anything, because I'm noticing it's already 7:40, and I haven't even, well, I just finished chapter 5. Is there anything in the readings that you particularly have questions about, so that since you're the only one that showed up? Oh, I'm glad you like it. I think it is too. I think there's a lot of information in the book, but I do think it's well written, and I think that it ties up really nicely. And as we go into the next developmental age, we're able to look back and see the progression of growth and development. Good. Okay, so should I continue then? Oh, should I just continue moving on to chapter 6? Yep, you sure can. Feel free. It's okay that you type slow, and feel free to ask any questions that you have. Okay, so I think somebody asked me one of the questions, and I could answer it now, what my favorite theory is. And while Piaget is one of them, well, actually, Piaget and Vygotsky both are my favorite theories, but just because I'm so fascinated by cognitive development. And I think you might be too, because you talked about brain development and how fascinating it is. And it is to me that our brain is just so amazing. But anyway, Piaget developed his theory actually by watching his 3 children and noticed how they identified things incorrectly, yet they had identification for things. And he came up with this idea that he calls it schemes, that we have actions or mental representations that organize knowledge. We have behavioral schemes, which are physical, and we have mental schemes, which are cognitive. So as we're constantly taking in our environment, we're making schemes. You know, how somebody walks, how somebody talks, what that means, how we interpret things. We're constantly taking in this information, and they get categorized in our brains, and he called them schemes. That's just the term that he used. And as this process occurs, we go through this assimilation, accommodation, and organization. And assimilation is this use of existing schemes to deal with new information. So we have these things that we're used to, and then something happens, and we have to change our scheme to then accommodate for this new information and take that new information and experiences into account. And as this happens, right, we start to organize these grouping of isolated behavior thoughts into a higher order system. For me, and some people disagree with this, but for me, this totally mimics the way that brain science has identified those connections that we make, those neuronal connections that we make. And I'll give you an example of what this means: assimilation, accommodation, and organization. When children are young, we start to identify things in their environment, right? And oftentimes we identify animals. And what are common house pets? Dogs and cats. So children are often first introduced to a dog and a cat. And for a child, a dog and a cat don't look very different, right? A dog has 4 legs, cat has 4 legs, they're both furry, they have tails, they have, you know, some dogs have ears that stick up, most of them, you know, some dogs don't, right? There are differences, we know that there's differences, but for children, they're still making sense of their world. So maybe their first introduction to an animal is a dog, and then they see a cat. Then they're going to call that a dog, until we then can identify and help them to organize that. That's a cat. You know, a dog barks, a cat meows. You know, what are the similarities? What are the differences? And that happens with all the things that are introduced: color, numbers, letters, all of those things, until they start to be able to take in that information. And I think if you could probably think of something, maybe even what you're learning in this class, right, that's based on your previous experiences, that we're constantly assimilating and accommodating information. And this process is called equilibration. And it's this constant thing that's taking place that puts us in disequilibrium as we try to figure things out. And then as we figure them out, we're in equilibrium. And all of this really speaks to the importance of how children need to be active participants in their environments, exploring the material and ideas to make sense of what they are experiencing. And that has to be with somebody who is able to facilitate that information. Does that all make sense, or is there any more clarification that I can provide? Okay. Do you agree with that? Okay. So this is just telling you what I need you to be familiar with. I'm not going to necessarily go into it. I can't cover everything in an hour, but anyway, so familiarize yourself with the sensory motor stage of development. There's 6 substages. There will be a couple questions on the exam about that. There's also one of the learning activities for your second learning activity. Is if you're more interested in this, you could do that. I do want to talk a little bit about one of the primary events that happen during the sensory-motor stage of development, and that's object permanence. And why that's so important is because once a child recognizes that things exist beyond their sight, meaning that they don't have to see it for it to exist, it does have an emotional component where, and I'll give you the example of you as a primary caregiver. Up until this point, right, you might be out of sight, out of mind. Once you leave the room, the child doesn't recognize that you still exist. But once they do, then they're going to cry out for you, right? They're going to want you to come back because they recognize that even though you're walking out of the room, you still exist. So that's an important milestone during that first stage of development, according to Piaget. And then also be prepared to evaluate Piaget's theory because it's going to be one of the questions on the exam, and there's a nice overview in your chapter about that. Do you have any questions about that? I'm so glad you're on here, Nancy, because, you know, it's nice to at least have somebody, otherwise I would have been talking to myself. Okay, so memory. Yes, they did do an experiment on object permanence, and that's how you can find out that a child has it. And how they did that is they took a ball and they showed it to the child, and then they hid it under a blanket. And a child that doesn't have object permanence won't go searching for it because, again, they think it's out of sight, out of mind. They don't think. They just don't recognize that it still exists. But once they go looking for it, that means that they recognize that there is object permanence. Oh, another thing I just wanted to add to that, it also sometimes is because so many kids are in early care, that when they begin to have object permanence, right, they may cry when their parent, their primary caregiver, their parent, leaves them with their other caregiver, thinking, and so sometimes the parent might think something's going on, something wrong happened, the child's scared now, all kinds of things. And mostly that just has to do with the fact that they recognize that their parents are leaving and that they're going to be with somebody else and that their parents still exist. And so one of the ways that caregivers can help infants with this is to say things like soothingly, like, you know, mommy or daddy, whoever drops them off will be back, and, you know, to talk to them, to help them through these transitions. They may not be able to articulate it, but they're able to understand what you're saying to them. And the more that you reaffirm for them that mommy or daddy always comes back, the more emotionally they're going to feel secure in their environment. So, okay. Then I wanted to talk a little bit about memory. There's implicit memory and explicit memory. And most of us we kind of think more of explicit memory, but implicit memory is memory that we don't have any conscious recollection of. It's just a memory of skills and procedures that we perform routinely. And one of the things that I could think that maybe an adult could identify with is once you learn how to drive a car, right? When you're first learning how to drive a car, you need your brain is constantly active. You know, I have to have my hand on the steering wheel. I have to, you know, put it in reverse, right? You constantly are thinking that all the way through. But eventually, it just becomes a part of your daily procedure. In fact, you don't even really think about it. You do it without really thinking it all the way through, and that's implicit memory. And it's unconscious. We do it with unconscious. I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but it has to me, that sometimes I get in the car and I know I made it home and I can't even remember how I made it home. And not that I've been drinking or anything like that. It's just, it's just so rote that I just go. Does that ever happen to you? Oh, there is? sometimes I get in such used to doing something that even though I'm going to go somewhere else, like for example, I go to work every day, right, and I turn a certain way, and sometimes unless I really think about it, I have to turn the other way, I just turn that way, and then as I'm going, oh, I didn't need to turn that way, I needed to go the other way, because it's just, you get used to it, it's a habit. Explicit memory is our conscious memory of facts and experiences. And our brain development accounts for this as we get older. But however, in toddlerhood and early childhood, children need to have a clue to be able to recall to somebody else the experience that they had for that day. And one of the things that we do in early childhood environments is to put up our lesson plans. And we do that because, did your child go to preschool, Nancy? Okay, so he went to kindergarten? Okay, so did you ever ask him when you picked him up from kindergarten what he did that day? Just what did you do in kindergarten? Or what did you do in school today? Oh, you preschooled him at home. Would he be able to answer what he did? Well, I'm sure he can tell you now. He can probably also decide whether or not what he wants to tell you now, right? Yeah. And oftentimes when you ask a child what they did at school, sometimes they'll even say nothing. But if you can say to them, did you have fun painting with the cotton balls? Or I noticed that your teacher put out such and such in at the science table. What was that about? If you can just give them some clues, then their explicit memory, you can elicit that, and their explicit memory, they're able to then recall. It isn't until we get a little older, our brain develops into middle and late childhood, where we don't necessarily have to have all those kinds of clues about things. So, hey, does he still tell you what he does at school today now? Like everything? Yeah, see, with more details, exactly. And you can see the difference from when he was younger. It's nice to have a child. Oh, wow, that's great that he's used to telling you. That's awesome. Okay, I'm trying to figure out what I want to. Because I'm running out of time, we have, let me see. You know what, I think I'm going to skip. How did that happen? How did I? That's interesting. Something's out of order. Oh, I must have put the wrong thing. I'm going to talk a little bit about temperament, because I think this is another important area for us to understand. We all have different, and when I say temperament, I don't mean being temperamental or having a temper. I mean it's our way that we approach our world. And Chess and Thomas looked at many, many different children and identified 3 temperaments that they noticed. And the first one is an easy child, and that easy child has a positive mood, they are quickly established regular routines, they are adaptable. They adapt easy to new experiences. They identified the second child as a difficult child. I have to tell you, I prefer persistence because I think that difficult sets a negative tone. Because these children do sometimes react negatively, and they cry frequently. They engage in irregular daily routines. meaning they don't always sleep at the same time, they don't want to eat at the same time, they don't want a toilet, you know, they don't have that routine, which can be difficult. But I think that there tend to be more persistent. For example, a difficult child, as identified, may not easily transition from one activity to the next because they're so focused on what they're doing that when we move them to another activity, it creates some disequilibrium for them, and they may have a negative attitude about it. And then a slow to warm up child has a low activity level. They're somewhat negative, low intensity of mood. In the early childhood arena, and even in teaching, it's important for us to identify these different temperaments because our job is to adapt ourselves to their temperament in order to provide for them this goodness of fit that's required for validation, and meaning that if we're constantly trying to change them, their interpretation is there's something that's not okay with me, or why, you know. So how is it that we can respect their temperament and in our early childhood environment, because we're going to have children that are of all different temperaments. And one of the things, and we're running out of time, so I think I'm going to end with this, but one of the things that I want to mention, that when we have children that may be persistent or difficult, instead of you know, insisting that they do this or do that, we gently can remind them. For example, we can give them a little warning. In 5 minutes, we're going to clean up. So that helps to alert them to know that, you know, this is going to be happening. So when we actually clean up, they're less apt to act so upset. They're less apt to be upset about it. Or, for example, a child who is easy, when you greet that child, you're going to be more robust because the way that they interact with you, as opposed to a child that's slow to warm. You may need to be a little more subdued. So the way that we interact is really important as well. Yes, it is. You're right. It is in Chapter 7. I misnumbered the slides, so thank you for. In fact, I'll fix that when I go to post it to everybody. But anyway, it's 7:59, and I did say that it was going to be from 7 to 8. So if there is anything else that I can help you with, you can go on and look at this, and I will also be posting this PowerPoint to the Blackboard. Is there anything else that you would like to discuss? Or, you know what, Nancy, thank you. It's been I've really enjoyed reading all the things that you write on your posts. You're very articulate. It's really a pleasure. So thank you as well. Have a wonderful night. Feel free to do that.